The year is 1489. In a stone-walled convent on the outskirts of Florence, a girl no older than 12 presses her face against a grate she will never pass through again. On the other side, her father adjusts his coat, signs a document, and walks away without looking back. He has just sold his youngest daughter to God. Or, at least, that's what the church called it. In truth, he sold her to something far less holy. Because behind those walls, there was no salvation waiting, no peace, no divine mercy, only silence, obedience, and men who answered to no one. What happened to girls like her? Girls pushed into convents not by faith, but by family finances, political strategy, or the simple crime of being born female, is one of the most deliberately buried chapters in the history of the church. Not because the evidence was lost, but because someone made sure it was never found. If that sentence unsettles you, good, it should. Because what you're about to hear wasn't pulled from conspiracy forums or fiction novels. It comes from sealed Vatican archives, Inquisition trial records, letters smuggled out of convents by nuns who risked everything to tell the truth, and the private journals of priests who, centuries later, still had no remorse. If you've ever felt that history has been cleaned up, wrapped in velvet, and handed to you missing all the worst parts, you're right. And here on Dust and Dynasty, we tear off that velvet. Every view, every like, every subscription helps us drag one more buried truth into the light. So if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. You're going to need it for what comes next. Now, let's go back to that convent, because that little girl just heard the iron gate lock behind her, and no one is coming to open it. Act 1. The girls who were sold. To understand what priests did behind convent walls, you first need to understand how the girls ended up there in the first place. Because this wasn't about devotion, it was about money. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, a family's wealth passed through its sons. Daughters were expensive. They needed dowries, large sums of money or land given to a husband's family upon marriage. And if you had 3 daughters, 4, 5, you were financially ruined. So the church offered a solution, a convenient, God-approved solution. Give your daughter to a convent. The spiritual dowry required by the church was a fraction of what a marriage would cost. In 15th century Florence, a marriage dowry could reach 1,000 florins. A convent dowry? Sometimes as low as 100. For noble families trying to preserve their estates, the math was simple. One daughter marries well. The rest disappear behind a veil. These girls, some as young as 7 or 8, were placed into convents through a practice called oblation. They didn't choose this life. They didn't understand it. Many of them cried for weeks, calling for mothers who would never visit. The church had a word for this adjustment period. They called it spiritual purification. The girls had another word for it. They called it hell. By the time the Council of Trent attempted reform in 1563, the problem was so widespread that church officials themselves admitted the majority of nuns in Italian convents had not entered willingly. Let that settle in. The majority. These weren't women who found God. These were women God's institution trapped. But being trapped was only the beginning. Because once inside, they entered a system designed not to uplift them, but to control every breath they took. Act 2. The hierarchy of silence. Convents were not the peaceful sisterhoods you see in paintings. They were rigid hierarchies, structured, ranked, and enforced with the precision of a military unit. And your place in that hierarchy was decided before you ever set foot inside. At the top sat the abbess, the supreme authority within the convent. She controlled the finances, the daily schedule, the punishments, and in many cases, who was allowed to speak and who was not. Below her was the prioress, her second in command, who enforced discipline and reported directly to the abbess. Think of her as the warden. Then came the choir nuns, women from noble or wealthy families who had entered with substantial dowries. They wore the black veil. They sang the divine office. They had private cells, better food, and access to books. They were the aristocracy of the convent. Beneath them, and this is where it gets dark, were the lay sisters, sometimes called conversae. These were girls from poor families who couldn't afford even the reduced spiritual dowry. So they were taken in as servants. They cooked, they cleaned, they scrubbed floors on their knees from before dawn until after dark. They wore a different habit. They were forbidden from singing in the choir. They could not vote in convent elections. They ate separately, often the scraps left behind by the choir nuns. And at the very bottom, the novices, new arrivals, girls still in their trial period, which could last years. They had no voice, no rights, no protection. They were watched constantly, corrected harshly, and punished for infractions as small as looking out a window too long. This wasn't sisterhood. This was a caste system wrapped in a rosary. But here's what made this hierarchy truly dangerous. It wasn't self-contained. There was one figure who stood above all of them, above the abbess, above the prioress, above every woman in that building. And he didn't wear a veil. He wore a collar. Act 3. The man on the other side of the grate. Every convent had a confessor, a priest assigned by the local bishop to hear the nuns' confessions, provide spiritual guidance, and oversee the moral direction of the community. In theory, he was a shepherd. In practice, he was the most powerful person in the building. Because here's what the church designed, perhaps without realizing the monster it was creating. The confessor had absolute access to the inner lives of these women. Every sin, every doubt, every fear, every secret thought spoken in the darkness of the confessional. And the nuns were required to confess. Not optional, required. Refusal to confess was itself a punishable sin. Now imagine being a 17-year-old girl, locked in a convent you didn't choose, speaking to the only man you'll ever be alone with, telling him your deepest vulnerabilities. And that man answers to no one inside those walls. The abbess couldn't discipline him. The nuns couldn't refuse him. The bishop who appointed him was often hundreds of miles away and visited once a decade, if ever. This was not a flaw in the system. This was the system. And it was exploited, systematically, repeatedly, and across centuries. In 1561, the case of the Convent of Sant'Ambrogio in Rome cracked open like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. A noblewoman named Princess Katharina von Hohenzollern, placed in the convent against her will, began to fall mysteriously ill. When she was finally smuggled out and examined, investigators discovered she had been slowly poisoned. But the investigation didn't stop there. It unraveled something far worse. The convent's confessor, a Jesuit priest, had built what inquisitors would later describe as a system of total control. He had manipulated the convent's internal hierarchy, handpicked a mystic nun whom he controlled, used her fabricated visions to terrify the other sisters into obedience, and, behind the walls, engaged in what Vatican documents carefully describe as repeated violations of his sacred trust. The Inquisition records held in the Vatican's own archives, later examined by historian Hubert Wolff in the 21st century, confirmed that the priest had sexually exploited multiple nuns over years, not in secret from the convent, in secret from the outside world. The convent knew, the abbess knew, but the hierarchy was designed so that no one inside had the authority or the courage to stop him. The only reason the case was ever exposed was because a princess had enough connections outside the walls to get a message out. Most nuns didn't, and Sant'Ambrogio was not an exception. It was a pattern.
Act 4. The Confessional as a Weapon. Church records from the 16th through 18th centuries reveal a crime so common that the Vatican gave it its own legal term, solicitatio ad turpia, solicitation in the confessional. It referred specifically to priests who used the act of confession to sexually coerce, manipulate, or assault the person confessing. And the numbers are staggering. Between 1551 and 1700, the Spanish Inquisition alone processed over 3,600 cases of solicitatio, involving priests and religious women. And those were only the ones that made it to trial. Historians estimate the actual number was many times higher, because reporting a confessor required a nun to break the very silence the church had trained her to keep since childhood. Think about the trap. If a priest assaulted a nun during or after confession, who would she tell? The abbess, who relied on that priest for the convent's spiritual standing. The bishop, who appointed him. Another priest, in another confessional, where she would have to confess the sin of what was done to her? The system was a closed loop, and the lock was shame. In 1622, Pope Gregory XV issued the papal bull Universi Dominici Gregis, which formally condemned solicitatio and demanded that cases be reported to the Inquisition. But the same document included a provision that tells you everything you need to know about the Church's real priorities. Any nun who falsely accused a priest of solicitation would be excommunicated. Not investigated, not heard, excommunicated. Cast out of the only world she had ever known. The message was clear. You can report, but if we don't believe you, you are the one who burns. Most nuns chose silence. Act 5. Walls that swallowed screams. If you're wondering why these women didn't simply leave, the answer is one word: enclosure. After the Council of Trent in 1563, the Church enforced strict papal enclosure on nearly all female religious orders. This meant that once a woman took her final vows, she was physically forbidden from ever leaving the convent. Not for illness, not for family death, not for any reason short of the building collapsing around her. The walls were not metaphorical. They were stone, sometimes 10 feet thick. The windows were bricked over or fitted with iron grates. The doors were locked from the outside. Visitors, including family members, could only speak to a nun through a double-grilled parlor window, with a chaperone listening to every word. And for those who broke the rules, the punishments were medieval in the truest sense. Nuns caught attempting to leave were subjected to imprisonment within the convent itself, locked in small, windowless cells called in pace, Latin for in peace. The irony was intentional. Some of these cells were below ground. No light, no sound. Food pushed through a slot in the door. Nuns placed in pace were sometimes left for months. Some were left until they died. In the Convent of Santa Monica in Perugia, which you can still visit today, archaeologists discovered a network of underground rooms with chains bolted into the walls. These weren't dungeons from a siege. They were punishment cells for nuns. Built by the Church, maintained by the Church, used for centuries by the Church. And the priests who controlled these convents? They decided who entered those cells. They decided how long they stayed. They decided if they ever came out. Act 6. The children no one was supposed to find. Perhaps the most damning evidence of what happened behind convent walls isn't found in trial records or papal bulls. It's found in the ground. During renovations and archaeological surveys of former convent sites across Europe, infant remains have been discovered in places no infant should have ever been. Beneath floorboards, inside sealed walls, in unmarked plots within convent gardens. In 2003, during restoration work at a former convent in southern France, workers uncovered the skeletal remains of multiple infants buried beneath the cellar floor. The remains dated to the 17th and 18th centuries, a period of strict enclosure when no man was supposed to enter the cloister and no nun was supposed to leave. And yet, there were children. The historical record connects the dots in the most disturbing way possible. Inquisition files from across Italy and Spain include testimonies from nuns who described becoming pregnant by their confessors or visiting clergy. Some were forced to give birth in secret. Some had their children taken immediately and placed in foundling hospitals,
the Ospedale degli Innocenti, with no record of their origin. Others were not so fortunate. A 1709 Inquisition case in Sicily documents a confessor who, upon learning a nun was pregnant, arranged for an herbal abortifacient to be smuggled into the convent. When it failed, the birth was hidden. The child disappeared. The file ends there. No follow-up. No investigation into where the infant went. The silence in that file is louder than anything written on its pages. Act 7. The ones who fought back. But not every nun stayed silent, and the ones who spoke were either the bravest women in history or the most desperate. Sister Benedetta Carlini, a 17th century nun in Pescia, Italy, became the subject of an Inquisition investigation that revealed layers of manipulation, mysticism, and control within her convent. But what made her case extraordinary was that the investigation, originally about her claimed visions, accidentally pulled back the curtain on the broader web of clerical interference in convent life. In Spain, a nun known only as Sor Maria smuggled a letter to the Inquisition in 1632, sewn into the lining of a laundry basket. In it, she described years of assault by the convent's confessor and named 3 other sisters who had suffered the same. The Inquisition investigated. The priest was quietly transferred to another parish. Sor Maria was placed in pace for causing scandal. She was never heard from again. Her letter survived. She didn't. And in Venice, the state archives contain records of the Provveditori sopra I Monasteri, a secular magistracy specifically created because the problem of clerical abuse in convents had become so endemic that the Republic of Venice decided the church could no longer be trusted to police itself. Their records, spanning the 16th and 17th centuries, catalog hundreds of cases of priests entering convents illegally, conducting affairs with nuns, fathering children, and, when caught, being protected by their bishops. Venice was one of the few places where the state intervened. Everywhere else, the church handled it internally. And internally meant invisibly. Epilogue. So the next time someone tells you that history is written by the victors, remind them, sometimes it isn't written at all. Sometimes it's buried beneath a convent floor, sealed in a Vatican vault, burned in a letter that never made it past the walls. The girls who were sold to the church didn't choose their fate. The hierarchy they entered was designed to erase their voice. The men who controlled them operated in a system built to make accountability impossible. And the evidence, the trial records, the bones, the smuggled letters, has been sitting in archives for centuries, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Now you know, and you can't unknow it. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, then do one thing. Share it. Not for the algorithm, not for us, for the women whose names were never written down, because remembering them is the least the world owes them. This has been Dust and Dynasty. We don't tell you the history you were taught. We tell you the history that was taken from you. We'll see you in the next one.